Welcome to Role Playing as Smart People. My name is Santa, and welcome to a little series I like to call
One
One
on
on One
one
with
with
Santa.
Santa.
Yeah. Did that sound corny? I don't care.
I, it kind of feels like you maybe should have had Jingle Bells along with it, and
oh,
I'm very much here for it. If you're adding that in post.
I am totally adding it in. By the way, everyone, this is Charlie, the lead writer of Shiver. Hello, Charlie.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. Um, I shouldn't. Okay, this is going to sound dumb. I conferred with the wifey, and she said this is dumb, but I thought this would be hilarious since this is the first one of One on One with Santa. How funny would it be if every single guest I have on from this point, if they sing the jingle too, and I just keep on adding one after another, all into the same jingle at the very beginning?
So adding a new line every time,
No, but
okay.
adding in a new voice.
Adding in a new voice. Oh
So
yeah, no, yeah.
so eventually it just becomes this one big
Okay.
cluster of voices all saying the same thing like a chorus.
Oh, fantastic! I mean, that's a unique way to assemble a choir for a podcast, but I'm very much here for it.
You want to do the one on one with Santa?
So just remind me of the tune again. So it's
One on one with Santa.
okay. Got it. Okay, ready?
Yep.
One on one with Santa.
Yeah. Okay, that'll be awesome. Thank you very much for yeah, for this has already gone off the
No
rails.
worries. I'm very game for odd audio experimentation. So
Oh,
do not worry.
excellent. What I'll do is I'll take that and I'll put that in with the intro right off the hop. It'll be great. But anyways, Charlie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your tabletop history? How did you even get started in this hobby?
Sure. So I'm Charlie Menzies. I'm the lead designer and writer for Shiver. I got started in role playing when I was at university. So I have a film and TV background originally in production, and I went to be a screenwriter. Is where I started. But I met a lot of fellow pop culture rabid nerds when I was at university who love telling stories together, various actors and writers and performers. And one day, a housemate of mine managed to get our hands on kind of a copy of like 5e, and we just started playing D&D together, as most people's intro point is now.
Mhm.
And we got really into it, and it got very goofy very quickly, and was a hell of a lot of fun. And yeah, like from that point onwards, I'd kind of always been into role playing games, but I got more onto the game master side after I graduated. And even though we're a small country, kind of my friends all got scattered to the four winds. We all kind of started working in different cities, different places, being on different sets. And funnily enough, I won a writing competition, which gave me enough money to actually get all the stuff I needed to kind of start running games myself.
That's
So
awesome.
set up an online group and started running games for my friends, and then from there it was playing different systems and noticing what players were struggling with, and then I started to develop Shiver off the back of that. Was where that came from. Was just playing with my friends and making tweaks and slowly building my own thing in the background, just to find a fun and unique way to tell stories that were based on films that we all loved and shared from our kind of university experience.
Oh, that's awesome. So for anyone who's not familiar with Shiver, how would you kind of sum it up?
So I say Shiver is a horror role playing game that allows you to play any horror movie, piece of horror pop culture, books, TV shows, comics, any setting, any character, anytime, anywhere. You can use the core system to tell that story. So you can be medieval peasants fighting a demon ball with spoons, like 1 minute, or you could be kids on bikes, go very Stranger Things, or you could be shooting off into space as like a Ripley style character, and punching his xenomorph with a dock loader. The next, it's very much a love letter to the horror genre that allows you to bring anything that you want to the table with that horror flair to it.
Oh, that's really cool. So out of curiosity, what when you were like, because you said you're designing this after like over a period of time, was there like a specific movie that you're like, I need to create this one? Like, I need to have this on the tabletop. Like, was there anything that was almost like that big inspiration for that?
That's really interesting. I think it was a collection of things because I found myself with using 5e, like kind of trying to pepper in certain films that I loved. So,
Mhm.
like, kind of putting Jason Voorhees in a swamp, for example, and having them stalk a bunch of fantasy characters, and kind of changing up the lore a little bit and having fun with that, as well as just, I think the main thing that I wanted to do was to capture the energy I feel when watching a horror film, like in a packed cinema. But putting that on a tabletop. So it wasn't like a specific film in particular, but I was really struggling with D&D as a core system, I would say, to replicate that feeling because of the power fantasy element of it.
Mhm.
Was really difficult to, how do I make something that feels scary but doesn't that doesn't kind of get neutered a little bit by how powerful the players are and how they
Yeah.
interact with it.
And in 5e, it tends to turn it's a little bit of a jokey system. Like there's that meme that kind of floats around where it's like how every game starts off and it's like all these grizzled warriors and then it flips to how it is after two sessions and it's Monty Python. Like it just does I get what you mean. It just doesn't really put itself into a good light when it comes to the more kind of hardcore or serious kind of settings.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, but I think for me, just to clarify, like I am no grouch at the table. Kind of like when it comes to humor, I
Mhm.
love jokes and humor at the table. But and I think honestly, like particularly with horror, levity and laughter is so important to balance out the more intense moments. But I
It
think
is.
you're completely right of that. There's this build up of kind of humor. I think that kind of emerges with D&D games, but also it's, I think, more like at its mechanical core, it's basically you're building from 0 to level 20 is like an ascension to godhood, which
Yeah.
ultimately isn't what a horror story is about. Like that's, if you think about your like a core character objective, like if you're thinking of horror stories, the kind of big in bold at the top of a character's motivation is survive in big red caps, like stay the f alive, like it's just is like don't die. It was, which is like I think like level 1 to 3 of D&D captures that really really well. So I
Oh
remember
yeah.
like playing like a level 1 D&D adventure, and some goblins turn up, and we think, oh, these are just a bunch of shit tier enemies. We're gonna kick the crap out of them. Like it's gonna be absolutely fine, right? And then smash cut to like the bars bleeding out on the floor, like the halflings up a tree crying. And like the goblins are just taking everybody to town. So I think it's kind of thing, like for me, it's almost, if you want to like kind of do a successful horror story, depowering your players ultimately enhances the experience a lot more.
Oh yeah.
And that was like kind of like a big guiding tenet for designing Shiver. Not like depowering, but kind of how do you bake into the mechanics this idea of survival and kind of your kind of like base level of squishiness and humanity, to make characters feel fundamentally mortal. Because if you feel mortal, you feel in danger of dying. Whilst I
Mhm.
think in D&D there is, I think, especially the preciousness around kind of characters not wanting them to die or let them go, but also this ascension to kind of godhood element means that you're inherently stepping kind of on the immortal boundary, a little bit there, which again I think this kind of like takes the sting out of a lot of horror when death may not be kind of on the cards as readily as it should be in that scenario.
Oh no, I definitely agree with you on that one. Like when I think of horror movies, I think of that suspense, the anticipation, the worry that around any corner like there could be like a jump scare or you're just going to see just the edge of something where if you were not watching this movie, you would like if you were just like casually watching the movie, you might not notice and you know for a fact that the players themselves or the actors in the movies their characters don't necessarily see that. And I think I read through your system and Uh, I thought it was very interesting, but a little bit more on that later because I do have some questions about your system. But I noticed you right now you have actually a double feature that currently is being funded on GameFound. Would you tell us a little bit about that? Because some of those modules I was very, very interested in.
Absolutely. So Shiver Double Feature is our attempt with this kind of like new expansion project for Shiver to start exploring the different ends of the horror bell curve, as I tend to call it.
Hmm.
So first up, you've got Shiver Slasher. So Shiver Slasher is like the biggest subgenre in horror, or one of, I would say.
Yep.
I've often said that horror is a broad church when it comes to being a genre, but in the sense of it being a broad church, slashers are pretty much Catholicism. It's a large chunk of horror. It's a big kind of area to explore. But it also kind of falls definitely more on the extreme end in terms of like blood, gore, violence, scares, jump scares, all of that. It's very much it ticks very much the quintessential boxes that you imagine kind of when going to a cinema to watch a horror movie and have
Hmm.
kind of popcorn being thrown everywhere as people jump in fright. And that is a great experience. If you are a big horror fan, I think like slasher films quite often epitomize those experiences.
Oh
So
yeah.
that's kind of one end of the expansion of that we're looking at. But in terms of thinking of it as a double feature, of we wanted to partner it with something that was exploring horror, but through a very different lens of looking at people who may be unsure of horror, who want to dip their toes in, but are have maybe kind of preconceived notions of the genre, or they want to play with younger players. They want something that's kind of a bit friendlier, a bit more on the side of peril than it is on of terror.
Yeah.
Um, and that's where Blockbuster comes in. It's exploring kind of stories which I've termed like Spielbergian tales of terror. Is how I tend to frame them. Of that, when we were writing them, and I was working with our new writer Adam, who's been doing the story content for both books alongside me. Is that we set out because obviously our background for both of us, because we trained together at university, was screenwriting.
Hmm.
Um, we were trained to know what elements you can and can't have for when you're doing a film classification. So, for example, like in the US, it'd be PG-13. Over here, it's a 12A, and that was the line that we drew of being like, kind of, okay, if we were writing this as a movie, what
Yeah.
elements would we keep in? What elements would we keep out so that you could have a slightly younger audience and it be a bit more kind of friendly, still keeping those elements of tension, those elements of horror that are there, but just bringing the intensity of it down. So these are kind of exploring things that are quite a lot of it actually that were like very inspiring for me. Well, conversations between me and my brother, who works as kind of editor and developer on the project,
Hmm.
of films that scared us when we were kids. Which we found was actually a very good metric for figuring out Blockbuster. So we talked at length about Jurassic Park. So like the first time we watched that when we were kids, was like the Raptors are some of the best horror villains
Of all
in
time.
cinema history, but they're not
I
considered horror characters.
I would
It,
agree with
yeah,
you 100%. Sorry to cut you
yeah,
off there,
yeah.
but like as a kid, my favorite movie of all time was Jurassic Park. And I totally know what you mean because that scene in the kitchen with the velociraptors and the two kids and how they're just pretty much like it's that cat and mouse game. Oh,
Yeah,
one of my favorite.
it's just pure perfect horror tension of like the creatures are they're menacing, they're large, they're intelligent. That is the biggest thing with the raptors, is that
Hmm.
it's looking at something that, you know, you think it's, oh, it's just a big lizard, but it's actually fiercely intelligent, like kind of near to a human level. And you know, them being able to use handles and all of those wonderful moments. Really, I mean, like the T-Rex is the one that gets a lot of love, but for me, it's the Velociraptors was always where it was at. I mean,
Hmm.
the thing I think people forget about that is Samuel Jackson gets killed, and they just find his arms like in that movie. Like, because I think it's because when we were kids, like we watched it. This we used to tape stuff on VHS. We were not a wealthy family growing up, so we used to tape stuff off TV. And in the TV edit, that bit was cut out So then we watched it a little bit later, like we got a proper like a non bootleg VHS of it, and all of a sudden Samuel Jackson's Severed Arms were in it, and we were like, "What is this movie? Like, where'd this come from?" We had no idea that was in there, which is just really fascinating. And to kind of stay on the Spielberg train a little bit more, like Jaws was another one. Our mum probably showed us that a little too young,
Mhm.
I would say. And I, like, struggled swimming in a pool for months after. Like, I was obsessed that a shark was going to somehow get for a vent, coming out of the cold ocean waters around the British Isles somehow, and get into a public pool. Stupid. It was completely irrational, but it's the effect that film had was very, very profound. But I must say though, not bagging on my mum at all. Absolutely love her to bits, and I do credit her with probably seeding that love of horror movies in me, like kind of from a young age, because she would always show us stuff and like test our boundaries as kids, like with what we were seeing,
Mhm.
to kind of like see where we were at as we were growing up. And I think that's a really healthy way of doing it, rather than obscuring or horror from people until you're like 18. I think that's a very
Yeah.
odd way of doing it. But yeah, no, it's so it's all of those movies, and there's like it's specific moments and memories that I think everyone kind of has, like the scarabs under the skin in the Brendan Fraser Mummy film, for
Oh,
example.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's one that popped up. Like even the ghost pirates from Pirates of the Caribbean. The first
Mhm.
Pirates of the Caribbean has so much horror in it, but I think people really forget about it because of how like big CGI swashbuckling it kind of became. But the first one's actually quite measured back on that front, and it's just yeah, it's examining those elements where kind of big bombastic action as well as spooky unnatural elements that kind of bring elements of peril, bring elements of terror in, really quintessentially just summarizes what blockbuster is, and that's kind of what we're going for with that expansion.
That that honestly sounds really cool. Because I was looking at a few of them. Unfortunately, I'm currently broke, or else I would have totally picked them up. But I was looking at the Blockbuster one. I was like, oh, that's such a neat idea because there is so many. And I agree, a lot of people don't realize how many movies have elements of horror in them that really kind of just like help them go. And I'm assuming kind of since the Blockbuster one is more rated towards, you know, a age of 12 up. I'm assuming the slasher one is more of the adult one, I'm assuming, or the higher
Yeah,
rating.
I'd say there's maybe one or two stories in the slasher book where it kind of comes in maybe more like like a 15, 16.
Yeah.
Because obviously we have the kind of we have 15 and 18 in our film classifications,
Hmm.
in terms of how they split. But I see, yeah, most of them are kind of like looking at 18 or like R rated, I would say, in terms of where they're looking. Because we in the books we put like a film style classification in there to like guide people,
Oh, that's smart.
as to like kind of what potential triggers there may be in there as well. Because the thing always with like horror, like safety tools in, as a side tangent, safety tools in horror are super duper important, like I feel like when you're playing RPGs, because ultimately there's a line in the core book that I have where, and I use it every time I run a game: we're here to play a horror game and have fun. We're not here to be horrible to one another. And you have to be careful, because obviously, like when you're treading that line of exploring something that triggers fear,
Yeah.
in people, of kind of finding like what those lines are and making sure that they're kind of protected and respected in kind of the best possible way. Um, but yeah, no, so it's, but we are going to be putting kind of tips and tricks in there of like, if you want to bring the age rating down, so say you've got like a 15, 16-year-old who wants to kind of play at the table, then just bringing some of those elements down, or like how do you like cut away from gore or imply stuff, very very much like how the best horror movies do, is that for me, I've always been a fan of the camera cutting away and us hearing a terrible noise of somebody being slaughtered than actually seeing the slaughter itself. And personally, I think that's scarier.
Hmm.
But it's also in many ways more palatable to me personally. But yeah, I think that's an interesting way to kind of approach it.
And I kind of agree with you with that. I find a lot of the time, like, because I forget who said it, but it was, um, s- I heard this quote once where essentially, um, the audience can think of more horrible situations than you ever could, and so feed into that. And I think that that is a bright way. And in fact, I feel like more modern movies have kind of lost that, almost like that feeling of we can trust the audience to think of something horrible. We don't necessarily
Mm.
need to show it and give really that same effect. Like, I don't know. I love. We were talking about this right before, but how we're both kind of a huge fan of the '80s movies, and they made those movies nice and scary, everything like that, without always the CGI. And I feel like if I was to run a game with your system, and to be honest, I'm kind of thinking about doing that on Halloween with a couple of friends of mine. Uh, I would take inspiration from like the '80s movies. Like I would want to take like the original. Well, this one isn't it? Is it a '70s movie? Um, but I would like to do the original Black Christmas and kind of do a twist on that. I feel like it would be a lot of fun.
Yes, I Christmas set horror is a big favorite of mine. I also love Black Christmas. Black Christmas is so I know it's not for everybody. It
No,
is a film that I would describe as fantastically bleak.
it
It
is.
really has that edge of um 70s cinema overall has this edge of nihilism to it, but
Hmm.
Black Christmas I think doesn't get talked about enough and kind of taking the biscuit of just how nihilistic that film is. But in the most best and possible way, in a really interesting way, and using that kind of setting of Christmas as a interesting offset to the raw kind of like brutal horror of like what's actually going on.
Oh yeah,
And
totally.
I love that juxtaposition with Christmas, of placing horrifying things in the holiday season. I think is a great staple, that
Oh,
should keep on going.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And I liked it with the ending with that one because a lot of movies, and this is just kind of like pretty normal, but they like to leave it at an ending. Well, that one kind of left it all up where there's still so many unanswered questions that just kind of almost made the killer even more creepy because you didn't know why he did it. He's still out there, still all these answers, but nobody really knows, and I find that so cool. But
Yeah, it's why I really jive with a lot of John Carpenter stuff, especially the first Halloween.
oh yeah,
And I think it's something that, like with the David Gordon Green ones, they managed to explore a bit in the first one, but then the others spiraled off. But I won't dig into that too much because I know there's a lot of controversy and infighting around the David Gordon Green Halloween, so I should probably not poke that. But anyway, but the John Carpenter Halloween, let's focus on that one. This idea of this unknowable, just marching evil that can't be stopped,
yeah,
of
like a
this
force.
exploration of just like trying to constantly throughout the film, like they're trying to like explain Michael, figure out like why he's doing what he's doing, and then the only person who really knows is his psychologist, the trained medical doctor, who's running around with a Magnum revolver, being like, "No, he's not crazy. He's the embodiment of pure evil. He has to be killed." Which to me is just like, it's where the trained doctor has basically gone off the rails and is spouting stuff that most people would be is crazy. But as you go through the film, you kind of, even though his
Understand.
methods are extreme, you come round to Loomis's side of thinking. Like, and it is just that element. I think it is an element of that. Not everything in horror, people's motivations always needs to be explained. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes it is almost like this unknowable evil that is just an evil, can be very very scary, and there's also an element of kind of almost like something that is just behaving kind of through animalistic instinct, and slaughtering things because it that's all it knows as
Yeah.
well, is that there is a not everything has to have kind of deep character rooted motivation when it comes to the antagonist side, because you can kind of start looking at interesting comparisons and elements by just exploring this idea of like, what if an element of pure evil did exist, like how does that affect people, or if something is kind of rampaging down through kind of midtown and killing people, it's just that is just completely wild and abandoned, they can't explain it. Because I think that's the thing that terrifies a lot of people, is not being able to understand something or explain it away. It is just a terrible horrible thing that exists,
Hmm.
that has no core reasoning behind it, and that I think is more terrifying in itself.
Oh, no doubt. So back back to the RPG for a little bit, because
Mm.
when I was reading the RPG, I saw maybe some inspiration from other systems. Did you actually have any inspiration from other systems that you drew into the game?
Um, so when I first started designing Shiver, my experience with other RPGs was relatively limited. Like 5e was my main one. I played a bit of Call of Cthulhu.
Hmm.
Um, but then some board games definitely came in there. So there's Elder Sign and a few other games. And then I hadn't played it. I still haven't had a chance to play it, I don't think. But with Blaze in the Dark, of
Oh yeah,
talking about clock mechanics. But really, Elder Sign. One of the I think within the Arkham Horror series of board games, where
yeah.
basically you have a clock that ticks up, and then at the end of the clock, the eldritch like horror turns up and you have to fight it. And when I was playing it, I used to play that board game with my friends. I found it very, very fun. But then that kind of evolved into the Doom clock, and then when I kind of was playing around with that, like researching other clock mechanics and games, and came across Blaze in the Dark and seeing the quarters, but then wanted to tie that in more to the dice mechanic more intrinsically,
Hmm.
with the strange symbols and failure generating doom. And very much the thing that kind of the unique element that was coming to Shiver with that was taking that filmic style of pace and structure, and
Yep.
basically taking like big tentpole moments from the three act structure of looking at lots of horror movies and seeing how do you apply that to a clock, how do you teach people to apply that to a clock mechanic. So yeah, so there's definitely like kind of lots of little bits that kind of fed into certain mechanics. The Doom clock is just one that stands out in terms of like how I kind of had an idea for it and then started researching it, and then other systems, and then it kind of blossomed a bit more as I kind of found more what Shiver's core element was, which was replicating a horror movie on the tabletop and really
Yeah.
kind of focusing that in. So yeah, in terms of that, like I like symbolic dice were there always from the start. But in terms of inspiration from this for the system, I hadn't really played anything with symbolic dice when we started designing. But then kind of after the initial book was released, I started playing games like Escape the Dark Castle. Has some certain elements that I think have some similarity that I really really like. When we did the first release, a lot of people mentioned what one is it? It's the Star Wars Edge of Empire game, which
Genesis.
The Genesis, yeah, Genesis. So that system, which I'd not played, so I had a look at it. Um, was a thing because a lot of people are this is a question that's come up before of like were you inspired by that system, and it's one I'd not encountered when I came up with the idea for it, and when I looked at it, it was because I find it very interesting as a system, but I think the place where Shiver really differs is that I really wanted the symbols on the dice to very firmly mean something to people at like an intrinsic level.
Yeah.
Like, so if you're rolling grit and you see a fist, you know that's, you know, your strength, your fortitude, your physical might. Whilst with the like Edge of Empire system, some of the symbols to me, like when I started looking into that, when a lot of people were mentioning it when we first started kind of talking about the system and marketing it for the first Kickstarter, um, the the symbols for me personally didn't really evoke something as strong, like some kind of base understanding of like, you know, like for us we have like smarts where you see like a brain and a light bulb and you know that's kind of like intelligence, it's coming up with ideas and investigating
Hmm.
stuff. So it's that kind of element of that. It's yeah, I think it's a lot of people see certain things in there and it's almost stuff that I've discovered through designing it. But there are elements definitely in there that did form um an inspiration. But I was always very set on dice pools as well because I just enjoy rolling lots of dice.
Yeah,
um
I would
and
agree with that.
and again that came more from, funny enough, that came more from my experience with board games than it did RPGs.
Hmm.
Because I'm so used to D&D of like rolling one dice and rolling another dice and rolling another dice, kind of like rolling it in an order. Whilst
Yeah.
like I love when it's like you just gather up a big handful of dice, throw it at the table, and you kind of meter out like what your success is.
Yeah.
And kind of doing the bright colored symbols was a big part of that to make it very quickly evocative of what what has happened when you've rolled.
No, that's awesome. I'm not gonna lie. When I was first reading your system, I was like, huh, I'm wondering if you got anything from Genesis. But yeah, that's really neat that you actually kind of took inspiration from board games and also just your own experience in designing it. That it really came to light. One question that kind of popped to my mind was, um, were you worried about using custom dice? Because I know there's a group of people out there who don't necessarily like buying specialized dices for specialized games. Were you worried about that at all?
So initially, no, but then when we started marketing stuff, definitely is what I would say, because it's something. So at that point, like kind of obviously, so Shiver's the first game I've ever designed. So I kind of when we kind of came into it, like I was very fresh faced and new within the industry, and I did not know how much controversy there was around proprietary dice. I just
Yeah,
thought they were cool and helped tell a story in a fun way. And that's always what they've meant to me for Shiver.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, there were a lot of people, and this is where the Star Wars Edge of Empire stuff reared its head, because there were a lot of people who got very angry about that, and I think it was something to do with like something to do with a release where there were only physical dice and there wasn't a dice rolling app, and like you had to pay for the dice rolling app, and there was a load of stuff, and people were kind of talking about that, and it was
mm,
definitely something very much that we heard, and that's instantly why we created a free dice roller when we released the game. That you can find on our website. It loads on a phone, it loads on a computer. It's absolutely free. You can remember your kind of elements of your character as well. If you're playing across multiple sessions, you'd have to note stuff down. Um, because ultimately, we don't want people to ever feel like they have to buy the dice because because it's a money spinning scheme. We
yeah.
generally want people to use the dice system as the way it was designed, because we feel it enhances the story, it enhances the experience on the tabletop, and that's always what it's about. So that's why we made a free dice roller, because we're very much committed to, we want people to play the system in that way to kind of experience it and see what we were going for,
Oh, that's
and
smart.
are going for. So yeah, and that will just forever be free, and definitely has a V2 coming up of us, because we make patch notes and stuff all the time of like people giving us feedback on the dice roller. So we're going to keep updating that and keep that supported as we keep making more Shiv stuff.
Oh, that's honestly really smart because I know there's a few games out there that I even myself have been interested in, and I'm just like, I would love to play this, but I don't want to go pick up dice for this one singular game. And that is a really smart move. I really like the fact that you just were like, no, we created a dice roller. Here you go. That's honestly awesome. And as dumb as it sounds, as someone who is, consumer of RPGs, if I saw that there was a free dice roller, I'd honestly be more incentivized to say, okay, I am buying the dice themselves now. Because for one, your dice look pretty damn cool. And two, I can tell it's not, as you said, it's not a Ponzi scheme where you're just trying to get more and more money out of anyone. So yeah, no, that's honestly amazing. I love that. Um, so I was kind of wondering, when you were creating the game, was there any like challenges that you faced where you honestly almost thought, I don't know how to get past this?
Oh, no, I've got a good example of this one. Combat. Right. So honestly, combat in RPGs is extremely difficult to get
Hmm.
right, I feel. And for us, we had the design element we kept butting up against is we play tested combat over and over and over and over with different iterations on things, of like kind of simplifying the action economy so it's just move, attack, interact. So you only have those three elements that you do, and that's it. Like we had discussions about it, so I very much fought for making damage fixed to reduce rolling, and obviously keeping things fully on the symbolic dice, so you're
Yeah,
not having to do any additional mathematical calculations. But the one thing we ran into, like right near the end, as we were kind of approaching the Kickstarter, is we just felt that combat wasn't scary enough, and we were trying to figure out how to do it. And then we sat down of being like kind of like, well, we want it to be an inherent risk when you're entering combat and you're attacking something. So it's kind of, what if the creatures, every time you hit them, there's a chance that they do something. And we're like, yeah, that's a good idea. It's like, what if they react to what the players are doing? And different enemies react in different ways. And from there, we came up with the React system of creating React tables. So in the core book, you have like bruiser enemies, agile enemies, intelligent enemies, and super scary enemies that can, every time they're hit, they have a chance to react. And it's as simple as you just roll one of our symboled d6s,
Hmm.
and depending on how reactive they are and the symbol that it lands on, there's a chance that they can react. And if they, the more dangerous the creature, the more reactions they have that are loaded onto the dice.
Oh, that's
So
cool.
so the chance of them reacting is much higher. So there is an intense risk reward of, you hit the creature, however, and there is an element of it's caveated, and learning a creature's reactions and having those obscured and not sure how an enemy is going to behave really added to the tension of people. Almost now, like now with players, like as soon as that came in and we started playtesting it, and somebody hit them, and then the picture picked them up and threw them out of a window, they were like, oh, this feels completely different. So then, you know, they'd start using range attacks or picking up like long branches and prodding the creature, like trying to figure out like kind of how it behaved, as a way. So there's almost like a, it really creates that horror element of like, if a monster turns up, you don't want the kind of classic kind of more like fantasy RPG thing of everyone gets baseball bats and runs towards it and just starts hitting it with sticks. It's because if everyone runs towards it and starts hitting with sticks, they'll do a bit of damage for sure, but all of those hits and then being really close is potentially going to trigger a reaction that could just wipe them all out, knock them all on the ground, render the, you know, cause it to like let out an ear-piercing howl and make them all terrified. There's a huge variety of stuff that can happen, and it completely changes the player psychology in terms of how you approach enemies. When every time you hit something, there's a chance that something bad is going to happen to you, rather than it's just a complete feel good. Yes, I hit the creature. I've dealt damage. Hooray for me! It's kind of like, now you have the element of, I've hit something, I've done damage, hooray for me, maybe we'll survive this. And then it is just, you just hear the clack of a dice rolling behind the screen, and then suddenly you're getting slashed with a machete for your heroics. So it's definitely trying to replicate that horror movie feel. So I think that was the biggest challenge, and that was quite a late in the game like cycle of development that the React system emerged. And as soon as we landed on it, though, we were like, how did we not have this from the very start? But that's the beauty of game design, of like just testing and testing and testing, trying stuff out, and always being very in tune with the feel of what you want to do, with what you want to achieve at the table. And for us, it was making enemies scary.
That I was just that's actually really interesting. Like that wasn't like immediately apparent to me just from reading it, but now that you mention it, like that's a really good kind of like ploy for even to promote the movie aspect, because nobody ever knows exactly what the monster is capable of. They discover it through trial and error, and what you're actually promoting with the dice, and especially um with the enemy being able to do all these actions, is you're almost promoting a way of uh learning and exploring to understand what exactly it's capable of. That's really cool. Like, it's very unique. I don't think I've ever actually heard an RPG with that kind of mechanic in it.
I think that's basically what we landed on, of like, as soon as we came up with it, we started looking around and we didn't really find anything that had the same feel, like in terms of reaction. So we were just very, I say, not smug, but like very happy with it, because suddenly combat just sung the way that we wanted it to.
You can be a little
Yeah.
smug.
Yeah. But it's, yeah, no, I think that's always the kind of like challenge. That's the biggest challenge in game design, I feel, though, because it's the most nebulous, is understanding game feel, which is a term of just kind of like how your game feels to the players that you're putting in front of it. And I think it's like, yeah, always being in tune with what you want to actually achieve and kind of getting back down to basics. And for us being a horror game, it was always, how do we make this more terrifying? How do we get people to not treat combat like, combat for, D&D or Pathfinder, or any other kind of more combat heavy system?
Mhm.
Because that's always the risk, is that because quite really, we're just very, very aware that most people who are probably going to be picking up Shiver, from the initial steps, definitely, we're probably going to be D&D players, or people who have played other RPGs that were probably in a more fantasy setting,
Mhm.
where the feel of combat is you're more equal with your enemies, you're working together, and you're going to be victorious. In Shiver, we wanted it to feel like it's dicey getting into combat, and you potentially might need to hide and run away. Is a big part of it, but not going the full Call of Cthulhu side of it, where combat is so deadly, it's ill-advised to do it at all.
Mhm. After
Because
all,
because
they
that
are the main characters, right?
Yeah, because that's the other side of the spectrum of that, and I love Call of Cthulhu. Just to clarify, like, for any Cthulhu heads out there, I'm not bashing the system at all. Because the whole, and that is another game that is very in tune with what it wants to do, because Lovecraft horrors are not built to be fought. That's not their purpose. They drive people insane and come from another world. They are basically gods, and you're running around as like a detective with a flashlight. Of
Mm.
course, you're in 2 hits you're gonna die if you get bitten by a shoggoth. Like, it makes a lot of sense, but with like trying to generate something that's more cinematic horror, we bend the rules, because you're completely right. Like, they are protagonists, or a group of protagonists, but I think there is a particular joy of finding character death that's thematic. That's also very, very fun, which I think is another kind of element that we really strived for with the system of kind of, and we have this like kind of with a lot of players of, somebody playing the Benny style character from the Mummy, like,
Yeah.
wants to get through 2/3, 3/4 of the game, but in that big like third and final act, they want to die. They want their character to have comeuppance for playing a
Yeah.
little shitheel. Like, they really enjoy that of playing to those cinematic archetypes and having the same level of repercussions that you'd see in a film. And sometimes death, whether it's noble sacrifice or kind of getting comeuppance and kind of getting theirs, is satisfying on both ends of the spectrum.
That yeah, that
Mm.
sounds great. Like, I'm just thinking of all the characters that I could play and how many characters I've played in RPGs that are, as you've said, shitheads, and absolutely loving it. And I've kind of almost at all the time hope they die at some point in some fabulous way. Like that, you speak to a lot of different players when you talk about this game, because you can have the courageous player, you can have the down to earth player who really just wants to create a realistic character. You can really take any real trope from movies and transplant them in there. Which kind of brings me to the next question that I was wondering about is how much flexibility do players have to create the character that they want?
Oh, so character creation. In terms of the unique combinations that you have, my brother is the one who's definitely more on the math side, do
Hmm.
the calculation of what the combinations are, and it's in the multiple of thousands. It's crazy, in terms of what you can actually achieve. And the thing is, that now just grows, because now, so like with our expansion Gothic, we have whole new archetype trees. In Slasher and Blockbuster, we're introducing more backgrounds that suit the subgenre even more. And that all plugs into the core system for building your characters. Um, and yeah, no, in terms of like to dig into it more, is that like you've got your 7 archetypes that are broad character types that you would find in any story from history. So
Yeah.
kind of waxing philosophical a little bit more about story in general, of like when you kind of start looking at like kind of monomyth theory and storytelling across history, there are certain characters, certain types of characters that do emerge very, very consistently. And one of the big ports of inspiration for this was Cabin in the Woods, the film that I think really epitomized that really, really well of that they're trying to basically replicate a horror movie that has archetypal roles to complete some form of ritual that is basically making a horror movie to appease fans.
Hmm.
Um, but we kind of took that and ran with it in a way that would allow you to play Ripley from Aliens to Eleven from Stranger Things to Solomon Kane, like anyone who you kind of wanted to play that had a horror flavor, you could achieve. So in terms of kind of how the system actually works, is you pick your archetype, you have a built-in strength statistically. So if you're playing a warrior, you're going to be chocked up with grit. You choose a deficiency, so you might be you've got all the brawn, but you haven't got the brains, and you like dip your smarts. And then from there, depending on your level, you can access a series of abilities. And the way that we've laid that out is as an ability tree. So if you're more au fait with like video game RPGs or those with certain elements, so like Borderlands, like is actually quite a good example of how they do this.
Yeah.
It's like having a tree where you start at the bottom, you have elements that connect together, you spend points going up a tree, and you have to have the prerequisite skill below in order to proceed. And for us, we just have a little rhyme of if you got the ability below, you're good to go. But we didn't want to. So in a lot of other RPGs, the thing that I noticed was you'd basically like pick a path really, really early on, and you'd be set and kind of stuck on that path unless you basically did a character redesign. And we didn't really want that if you wanted to tell a longer story. So
Yeah.
something emerged by going down a skill tree route with having multiple paths is there's nothing to stop you from so using the warrior as an example. So in the skill tree there are three paths for it. So you've got your fighter in the middle, which is kind of all about like tactically controlling the battlefield, knocking people over, slowing enemies down, playing around with those elements of giving you more fighting abilities that give you the tactical edge on the battlefield. To the left of that, you've got the berserker. It's your chock full of like rage and anger. You don't like using weapons. You like using your mitts and just punching your way for a problem. And the more damage you get, the more attacks and more health you get as the closer to death you become. And then on the right, you've got Protector, which is more about taking lots of damage, soaking it up, and protecting other players. So there's a skill literally called Get Behind Me, where it is, the jock with a heart of gold can dive in front of the skinny nerd and absorb all of their damage, for example. So the thing with that is though, is that like those paths are very much like playing to a certain type. But and if you wanted to, be the jock with an anger problem, you just go straight up the berserker. But you just go straight with the berserker. You just go straight with the berserker path.
Yeah.
But you could be someone who's like very brawny, really good with your fists, but has a heart of gold and likes to protect your friends. So you could do 2 points in the berserker path, and then maybe do a couple of points in the protector path. And something emerged when we were designing and then getting playtesters to build characters is we noticed a pattern of basically like you can either build a character tall or you can build them broad is how we referred to it.
Hmm.
So you can build them specialist in one area and one kind of trope based trait, like being angry, being tactical, being protective, or you can design your character's abilities more broadly. Maybe not have access to as powerful abilities at that for being at that level,
Yeah.
um, but have a broader skill set to you that represents the complexity of your character, the nuance of your character, of being like, if I want to be good with punching with my fists, I don't need to be a rage filled like monster. I can have other elements to my character as well, and we really wanted that to be represented in terms of how you could build a character, and that flows out into the background system as well. So you can pick a background, which we themed around the archetype. So we have warrior backgrounds, maverick backgrounds, scholar backgrounds, but any background can be combined with any archetype. So you can be the muscle bound jock who is also a nerd. You can be the valedictorian and still be really good at football. That's fine. Like you can build that character because those people exist. Tropes are great and tropes are fun, but we wanted to make sure there was a system where anyone and everyone could be represented, and any character you come up with, realistic, not realistic, tropey, or more grounded,
Yeah.
could be played.
Oh, that's really cool. Um, so, because you said are you like pretty much like your group's forever GM at this point? Out of curiosity.
A little bit. But not like I used to be. Not so much anymore. more and more of my friends, and this makes my heart absolutely sing. Is since making Shiver, a lot more of my friends have I've made them into RPG converts because like designing Shiver, I really wanted to
Yeah.
make it a beginner accessible system, and some of them really were unsure of it. They were intimidated by stuff like D&D. Seeing a whole sheet of numbers just scares them off.
Mhm.
Um, but then, like, they've played a couple of games with me, and then some of them have gone away and written their own horror stories, and we've played them. And people who've never directed, like that have been a GM for a game, like jumping in at the deep end and really having a go of it, just like taking movies that they know and just converting the plots and making players the characters. Has an intense kind of fun to it, and so it through actually designing Shiver, the game that I really wanted to play, it has allowed me to escape being the forever GM because it's basically I've looked at my friendship group and designed a game that I know they can play and also run.
That's
so, so which is lovely. So but yeah, no, I also have more RPG friends now as well from like kind of being more involved in the
mhm.
community. So like I have a one shot club that's starting where we're rotating GMs and doing like basically it's a one shot club as we're
Yeah.
calling it, where we're doing a different GM, different system every month.
Oh, that's
Um
fun.
and doing that because it's one of the things is like I love Shiver. I love playing my own game. I have a lot of fun with it. However, it is nice just to have a complete palate cleanser and play like Warhammer Fantasy or play like Morkborg or Vaesen or just having a look at what's on my shelf currently that still hasn't been played. It's and is on the roster for this one shot club. But yeah, no, it's yeah. So it was a problem when I first started out, but yeah, definitely not the eternal gem anymore, which is nice.
It's actually interesting one of the words that you just used because like in my own little group we've come up with the term of palette cleanser RPGs, which are there not to be like this full blown massive campaign, which massive campaigns are fun, but sometimes you just kind of want to cut loose a little bit. And we've been referring to a lot of like the smaller RPGs that might be good for 1, 2, 3, 4 sessions as palette cleanser RPGs, a way to clean the palette and just make it so you're ready to play another game right afterwards.
Yeah.
Um, but going into that, would you consider your RPG? And I don't mean this in a negative way because I feel like they're absolutely fantastic, and in fact, I prefer playing palette cleanser as opposed to full scale games, but would you consider your game more of a palate cleanser meant for a few sessions before taking a break on it and then coming back later, or
I say it's interesting because I think Shiver's definitely very capable of long format play if that's the way you want to play it. But I would say where we've seen people using the system and like where it's really flourishing at the moment uh, is the way that, and it's a way that we've been marketing it as well, especially the core system,
mm,
is almost treating Shiver like getting your friends round for a movie night to watch a horror movie, but instead you're playing it on the tabletop, and it can just be a night. Or quite often when I like play Shiver, if I'm playing it with a group and I've got a bit more time, then I almost split the three acts of the movie up into
yeah,
sessions. So Act One, Act Two, Act Three, and then we're done, and that's it. So and I kind of very tightly plan it, so I just know that it's going to have that finite sense of pace to it because I think
yeah,
that's very very important. But on the flip side of that, with stuff like Gothic, where you've got mechanics that tie Doom clocks together, like encourage long form narrative play and long form consequence, of making the world more horrific by the players failing or generating more Doom, there is definitely the scope for long format play as well, and that's something we're growing in various different ways, and have been doing in slasher and blockbuster well as well through new mechanics that we'll be introducing.
yeah. Actually, that was a question I was going to ask as I was looking through, but I kind of forgot about it. I noticed on the which one is it? The slasher one. Uh, what is that title? That again? Generation.
Oh, Generation Murder, yes. So
Yeah.
yeah, so the slasher expansion book. So I'll explain both because they have a interesting kind of mirror to one another in terms of how they work. So Shiver Slasher with Generation Murder is introducing something called the inheritance system.
Hmm.
So with Slasher, the Slasher stories that are going to be coming out of the book are inherently very deadly. Your survival rate on those stories is, your first and second act, most people are probably going to get through. But when you get to the third act, as in every slasher movie, bodies are going to start hitting the floor. Like it's going to get dicey.
Yeah.
And we wanted to introduce an interesting way of with elements that have a higher element of lethality. How do you do continuous play? How do you do, like, so say you want to do, a slasher franchise, as it were, that has like 5 films in it, like Nightmare on Elm Street. How do you
Yeah.
connect those together if characters keep dying? Um, so we came up with the inheritance system of so if your character dies, there is also an option to retire if they survive multiple movies and suddenly they're 90. And potentially you want to step that character down and have somebody step into their shoes, but death is definitely more the intended consequence.
Yeah.
um, that you can pass on elements to a descendant, like a mechanical descendant, a character who has a emotional link to that character in some way, who has elements passed down to them. So that has some positive elements. So it can be a physical item. So it can be the machete that you dealt the killing blow to Jason Voorhees with, for example, is passed down as a family heirloom. But it can also be a positive memory or a skill that's been imbued. So the to use the Halloween film, for example, the David Gordon Green one, a requel, as we've tended to now call it, where Laurie Strode has kind of gone full survivalist mode. She taught her daughter how to shoot. She taught her how to trap, how to, if Michael Myers ever turned up again, how to protect herself. And that can manifest as a core memory that is then passed on to a descendant.
Oh,
Um,
that's
so,
super cool.
so those are like the positive elements, but there's always a double-edged sword with these kind of things, however, because ultimately, using the David Gordon Green Halloween example again, Laurie imports a hell of a lot of trauma and fear onto her descendants, of basically developing this paranoid fear of this boogeyman figure of Michael Myers, that has a negative effect on those characters, which manifests as flaws and like mechanical debuffs in certain scenarios, very much like the fears in the game. So it's kind of exploring this intergenerational passing of the torch,
Hmm.
that includes like the positive elements of like resilience to survive these kind of deadly slashes, but also the negative elements of kind of inherited trauma that you see through this cyclical nature of slashes almost haunting a family again and again and again.
Oh, that's so fun. No,
So,
yeah, that's crazy. That sounds stupid fun. Like, I know I've just been saying the word fun a lot, but hearing you talk, and especially as a person who loves horror movies and has imagined my not myself, because I don't want to die, but imagined scenarios with horror movies, it just sounds so good. Like,
thank you.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And
Yeah.
I'm surprised how much I am just adoring everything about this. I started off with just picking up the the quick guide, and I
Mm,
read it, and I was like, oh, this is really neat. And then um, I wanted a little bit more, so I saw that there was a sale right now on Drive Through RPG, so I actually picked up the core book, and I've only had a chance to glance at it at this moment, but like I I'm very excited to try and play this game with people.
oh, fantastic! Thank
Yeah.
you. It's yeah, but for any of your friends who you're like wanting to get into it, because I think as horror fans, tell me if this is wrong, because this is my experience, is that I've converted a lot of my friends to the TTRPG side. However, horror I find can sometimes be a bit of a harder ask. Like some people just very much do not like they just see horror and they just go no. They hear the word horror, they just go no. And that's kind of more what Blockbuster's about, is getting people to dip their
Hmm.
toes in and almost educate people that like element, just because something, I'm using the word horror, like Jurassic Park has elements of horror in it, but people
Yeah.
don't consider it a horror film, as does Stranger Things, as does like so many elements of media, because it's such a broad and nebulous term sometimes. And with Blockbuster, the mirror to the slasher mechanic is we've created a almost like kind of meta narrative mechanic where instead of playing a character in that situation, you're playing an actor who's starring in the movie of that. So we're kind of like
Oh,
drawing it back more to the cinematic root of things. Um, so your character can die because they're in a movie and they can die in a dramatic way. But the way that we interconnect that is that we engage more with the cinematic tropes in terms of the styles of actors that you see emerging in these kinds of movies. And the actual mechanical system for it is called the Road to Stardom. So you're basically starring in a series of movies and charting an actor's career, where in between you can get accolades, or you can get bad reviews, which you can then use in your future movies, your future games, playing that actor, as boons or buffs or debuffs, depending on kind of how well you've performed to your type. Because we like explore things of being like, what if somebody's like the comedic relief, and then it kind of rewards somebody for playing kind of to that cinematic archetype, and having almost like objectives to kind of have to make the movie a hit at the box office.
yeah,
Which we found is a really fun way of, especially for new role players as well, of almost like kind of teaching people of being like, think about your big blockbuster movies that you like where, characters may not have like a crazy amount of depth
yeah.
sometimes, especially side characters, but they're really, really fun and they achieve like a certain like function within the story, and this is who they are and this is what they do. And it just means that you can have a kind of lot of fun with it. But we tie that all together by having a kind of interlude narrative. So between movies, there is a spooky mystery that's going on the studio lot. That you're playing as your actors in those moments, like trying to figure out what's going on as you're preparing for your next role, which ultimately culminates in you and all your actor friends who've starred in all these films with you, going along to an awards ceremony where some of the horrors may become a little too real as you try to fight them off, not as characters, but as the actors you've been playing all along.
That I like how you're actually like you're making almost like a meta narrative within your meta narrative. Like
Mm,
you're now not only playing in the movies, but you're also playing as actors within the movies that are dealing with an actual potential threat. Like you're you're creating
yeah,
a lot of spider webs. You're like in
yeah,
what's that movie called? Inception at this
yeah.
point.
Well, I just like that, like the cyclical nature of almost kind of being through playing these characters of kind of like what do these characters learn? Like what do they actually what could translate out into real life in kind of
Hmm.
fun, amusing, and helpful ways for players. Um, but then it's also like kind of that meta narrative, that extra meta narrative thing is it's just something that's there in that Legends of the Silver Screen book, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the element that you use because we. So I've talked with quite a few people already about how you can. So with Road to Stardom, you could just create any movie that you want and use the kind of like award system like within the Road to Stardom to help develop character and give some extra like buffs and debuffs and encourage characters to like play to type and have fun with it and not have that additional narrative underneath it where you play as the actors, um and kind of work it that way. And it's very similar with the inheritance system. So I was just talking to some people, so we are talking about Pendragon, the Arthurian Knight RPG, and somebody mentioned the Song of Ice and Fire role-playing game as well. And we are talking about what if you use the inheritance system to basically role play as members of a noble house who maybe have a curse on them and are haunted and have ghouls and ghosts, who are constantly trying to kill them. So then when your characters die, you pass on to this generational curse, as well as all these boons and kind of flaws as well. And play a completely different style of horror story. It doesn't have to be a slasher story. It just so happens that it works so well for slasher. That's where we've introduced it. But we're really excited to see how people take these modular elements that plug into the core system and run with it and do interesting things with it.
So here's kind of a question I have for you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know I've been asking you dozens of questions, so
That's all
this
right.
should not be surprising. But do you think, because like you said, you were pretty new into RPGs when you started designing this, you really only played 5e. Do you think almost not having that experience of knowing a lot of different games may have actually ended up helping you in creating this system?
You know, I think possibly. I've not really thought about it before like that. But yeah, because I think really for me, fundamentally, it always came down to what is the best way that I can develop mechanics that can help me tell the stories that me and my friends want to tell. Because
Hmm.
for me, I very much have always seen tabletop RPGs as very reminiscent of like gathering around a campfire and telling stories to one another, whether that's, tales of high adventure or, ghost stories at camp. Like that, it very much has that specific flavor to it. And quite often like you have that with like games that you do with actors when you're preparing to direct them in roles and certain elements. So there's a lot of other stuff that came from outside of games, in a lot of stuff from film and TV, I would say, actually came in, because for me, I just wanted to play movies and replicate a cinematic experience on the tabletop. And I think that's part of the slightly frustrated creative within me of having all this training and knowledge in film and TV, but not having the funds to make, a big the high budget blockbuster movie, or
Hmm.
the horror movie of my dreams. It's But I can bring that alive on the tabletop, and I can share it with people, and they can play it and they can live it and inhabit it in so many different ways and develop so many different endings by just giving them a system and a framework for stories to kind of generate their own kind of cinema experiences, but just through kind of rolling some dice and interacting with friends. And I think that's really where it stems from more. And I think you're right of I didn't really have any kind of like, I mean, like I played 5e, and I've played load more RPGs now. Like this is the thing. But I think it's already ingrained in my head, and it's something I've already learned of just being. I love other games, but I don't really want it to color my design. I'm more drawing from outside my experience from outside games to see what's new I can bring to the table. Quite literally, the tabletop. What new elements I can bring.
And you can really tell that because even hearing you talk, if we didn't say the word tabletop RPG, or talk about the dice or anything like that, you could swear that right now we're talking about almost the creation of a script and creation of characters within a movie, and it really truly embodies that feeling. And I think you've
Mm.
done a fantastic job of delivering a product that's not only unique in the tabletop genre, but also I think unique in a perspective that it almost feels like it's a little bit more than just a tabletop RPG. So,
Oh, thank you. That's a huge compliment. Wow. Yeah, no, it. I think on that like kind of one of the things that I was kind of thinking about recently, it's like with the core rule book is with that element in terms of like talking about almost like it making a script, is that a lot of the mechanics are almost like the screenwriting training I had of how I would generate characters, or how I approach writing stories. I kind of found a way to communicate that and sometimes add mechanics to it. And one of the things that I was very, very keen on, because it's not to throw shade at any particular RPG at all, but from kind of reading a bit more broadly now, there's loads of fascinating mechanics out there that do really interesting things and generate very different feelings at the tabletop.
mhm,
But for new people who want to get into the hobby and they want to run games, there isn't a lot of guidance, I find, on how do you actually tell a story. And I know that sounds silly sometimes, I think, but honestly, like storytelling to me is a real art form. It's a real skill that you have to practice that has certain rules to it. Stories have structure and beats and elements, and I think some people kind of come away from playing like big fantasy adventures and they feel frustrated that it doesn't feel like Lord of the Rings. It doesn't feel like Conan the Barbarian. It doesn't feel like the thing they're desperately trying to replicate.
mhm.
And that's not because they're doing anything wrong. It's because I think there needs to be more guidance and more dialogue about how we tell stories on the tabletop. Um, because I'm sure this is definitely something that's been academically written about, but like my feeling on with fantasy is that there is the problem of what I've termed. I'm sure there's a proper term for it. So this is me just spitballing, but like the eternal adventure.
Hmm.
Because it's the thing of why so many people who talk about D&D or Pathfinder or any long running games, basically any games that are nearing sessions in the hundreds,
Yeah,
um, is that stories are always more satisfying if they have a finite end. Having something that ends and has a defined just conclusion is so much satisfying than something that peters out and doesn't really um finish in a way that's satisfying to everybody. And which is why I encourage like embracing character death, embracing, the world ending, embracing stuff finishing,
yeah.
because in a way it concludes it and provides such more of a satisfying narrative experience when you just let things end. And that's something I've really wanted to. I tried to pack into Shiver by talking about like 3 act structure. How do you apply that to a game? How do you pace a session? And talking about that just more, because I think it's very important and it gets closer to what people want to achieve with these kind of games.
Yeah, no, I'm actually definitely in agreement with you on that. I think another kind of issue that we were kind of having with the industry, and I don't blame these people for it, but I think it's set up almost like an unreasonable expectation, and I think it's like Critical Role. You've heard of them, right? With Matt Mercer playing the 5e,
Oh yes, absolutely. And I think I've heard about of this before, like in general as well. Like it's
the
something
Matt Mercer
I
effect.
the Matt Mercer effect. Yeah, it's something that has been discussed at tables and things. I think he's he's a fantastic DM. Like he's
Oh yeah,
brilliant. Like the people on the cast are great as well. But it is, yeah. It's just reminding people of like when they get frustrated that that's not the experience that they're having. It's like they're professional storytellers. They're professional actors. They
they are.
are they are specifically trained to be doing what they're doing.
It's
And
setting up
it's
an
yeah.
unrealistic standard for how a game normally goes, not only for the players who have watched every episode of Critical Role and like, well, this is how I'm
Mm,
assuming all games should be played, but also I feel it's for the GMs too, who I think there's a lot of potentially really good GMs who are almost scared off after watching Critical Role and never GMing me
mm,
before because that's the standard that it almost places. And your RPG is really interesting in that aspect because it is specifically flying, not necessarily like because again, good storytelling is very important. It's not, but it's flying almost in the opposite direction of it, where it's saying, no, we don't need to have 32 episodes in this one city before moving on to this event and this event and this event. This is
mm.
all happening in I'm not too sure how long the usual span of your game is, but this is all happening in the time that you could watch a movie.
Yeah, and that's quite often, especially when I run streams. Like so I just did 2 recently, and I think they were maybe 3 hours tops, I'd say,
Oh,
of like 2.5 hours for a whole story. And we played a condensed version of the slasher starter set,
oh, nice.
which is a bit longer because it's designed to teach people the mechanics and elements. But these are people who played before, so I compressed a lot and played around with the format of it. And it's that idea of and I think it's a really good way to help nip that critical role effect in the bud for people
Hmm.
is measure your expectations. You're not trying to make, you know, Lord of the Rings or a Wheel of Time scale adventure. You're trying to run a feature length movie in a night or 2 nights or 3 nights. Keeping things finite, keeping the characters finite as well, too, because I think there's also a interesting element I think of breaking down the walls of preciousness around characters as well, of that good drama can't exist without kind of conflict and the threat of people dying.
Yeah.
And I think that's more of a thing that kind of emerges with like D&D and fantasy role playing in general. um but yeah, of just like kind of having free sessions, because I think it's deeply freeing from a narrative sense, because it's like things are going to be finite, and for players it's great as well, because like it's like, as I said, it's the Benny from the Mummy effect of people playing the absolute, like, kind of human antagonist in the story, that's generating a lot of drama, having a lot of fun, building tensions within the group in a really fun, kind of cinematic way. But they want, by the time you get to that third session, they want their character to die, and you can give that to them, and it's satisfying. It's satisfying for that character to pass away. And also we introduced loads of other mechanics as well of like, you can become, if you get bitten by a werewolf, you can become a werewolf and attack the players, and you kind of almost join the director side of the table. Or you can turn into a ghost, and interact with the story in like a very unique and different way. But ultimately, when the story ends, your business is going to be concluded and your spirit's passing on. It's yeah, I think having that finite element is what creates a more freeing atmosphere to make getting on the GM side of the screen less intimidating,
Yeah.
because it doesn't feel like you're not going to have develop your entire continent and fantasy world to tell a 12-part book series in tabletop format. That's not
No,
what you're here for. Yeah.
yeah, you just want to recreate the movie Pumpkinhead. So you're like, okay, this is what the premise is. I've changed up that monster, but yeah, I just want, like, me, honestly, I love and we're getting close to an hour and 15. I don't want to take up too much of your time. But like when I think of horror movies, I love specifically, I think, two subgenres of it. And one of them is kind of almost like the monster horror movie, where there's either like one big monster or a bunch of small monsters that are really just antagonizing this group of people or an entire town. Like I said, Pumpkinhead, I love that one. The Leprechaun movies are hilariously, well, the first one was scary, but once he started going into space, I feel like they may have lost the plot. But
Yeah, no, I know what format you're talking about entirely, because I think like Aliens has definitely got a big vibe of that as well.
yeah.
I recently watched Critters as
Oh,
well.
hey, me
Yeah,
too.
yeah, you've got like the big critter and the little critters in the first one, and
Oh
and
yeah.
it's yeah, it's yeah, I love that, and to a certain degree you have it with Gremlins. Like you've got Spike being like the central smarter gremlin, and then all the others. It's a really nice format where you can have like almost one powerful boss enemy, but varieties of weird and wonderful horror enemies kicking about as well. And we definitely play to that in a lot of our stories as well, because it's just a lot of fun to play, and a lot of fun of kind of like mixing stuff up in terms of the scenarios that you encounter.
I swear, like, you just, like, at the beginning of this, of us talking, you mentioned my one of my favorite movies of all time as a childhood, and now you just mentioned the second one, and that is Gremlins. I freaking love Gremlins, and I think if they gave it to a director and said, make this one a little bit more scary, you would have one of the best monster movies of all time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, between you and me and everyone listening, I have a Gremlins esque Christmas themed Shiver adventure that I have run a couple of times,
Yeah,
over the Christmas period, that I would love to publish. Maybe just as a PDF. I think like online soon. That is very Gremlins inspired, because me and my, again, I don't know if he was here, he'd attest to this as well. Me and my brother grew up on Gremlins. It was in
yeah.
our family was never. I think, as you can probably tell, our movie taste is quite eclectic. And at Christmas, our Christmas movies are like Gremlins, Die Hard, and like various other almost and anti-Christmas movies, as it were. Like, not a fan of schmaltz, but we like the love the setting and the contradictions, and a like kind of nice weird funhouse mirrors you can draw up against the holiday
Yeah.
season.
And I can't believe I watched this as a kid, but like when I think of Christmas movies that we watched, it was, yeah, Gremlins was one of them. Black Christmas, which I think I saw when I was like, for the first time when I was like 12 years old, and we watched it almost every time afterwards, which I
Mm.
feel like for a 12-year-old, probably not the best movie to watch, but I loved it. And another one, which this one's going to come out of totally left field, but for some reason, uh, every single Christmas we watched it, was Hocus Pocus.
Yeah, no, To be honest, I think I had a similar thing of like where I'd watch Hocus Pocus around that time. I guess because Halloween and Christmas aren't far from one another, it would still be kind of like doing the rotation. But
Yeah.
there is almost like that fun family energy of it, but it's yeah, it's more meant for Halloween, but I think it has broadened its appeal beyond.
I almost
Um,
feel like it's just because as you said before, Christmas is meant to be kind of like a joyous time, and then it's almost that flip of the script of yeah, it's a joyous time, but now people are being murdered, and
yeah,
I don't know. I feel like that is a lot more people enjoy it than you would expect.
yeah. Because I'm trying to think that there's quite a few Christmas horror movies that have like entered my rotation. I mean, there's the like Krampus movie.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I
yeah. I
I
saw
I
that
I
one.
I've watched. That's made its way in there a couple of times. Another one that I think is a bit more divisive is Better Watch Out. I very much enjoyed that.
Oh, I
Um,
don't think I've
uh,
seen that one.
it's kind of dark Home Alone is what I would is how I would describe it. It's Home Alone if it were very much a horror movie.
More adult.
Also a like if you like your Shaun of the Dead almost mixed with musicals and you like
Yeah.
British indie films, there's a British indie film called Anna and the Apocalypse about a zombie outbreak in a small British village.
Sorry,
Um,
what's it called? I gotta write this one
uh,
down.
A- Anna and the Apocalypse. So it's a zombie Christmas musical. It's it's a bizarre film, but like I'm supporting the British indie film industry because it is an absolutely wild movie. It's a hell of a good time, I would say. So I definitely recommend that to add to your
Well,
Christmas horror roster.
I'm gonna add that one to my Christmas horror roster. So since we are in in the best month for horror anything, October, what movies are you watching this month to keep yourself in the spirit?
Oh, what have I watched this month? I've watched quite a few.
Because I've watched quite a few too, and I need new suggestions. And yeah,
So I watched the new Halloween film, but I think
oh
I've already mentioned I might not want to open that can of worms, because
yeah.
it's yeah, it's controversial. So yeah, I'll skirt around that. I watched the new Hellraiser, which I personally very much enjoyed. I think it very much managed to capture the energy and ethos of the original Hellraiser and Clive Barker's stories, but put a very interesting and new spin on it. That I think worked really really well.
Okay, I've been
Um,
actually avoiding that one because remakes most of the time don't get a good one. But I might add. I'll add that.
it's I kind of I like the first Hellraiser's got a very special place in my heart. Like I absolutely love it. But I think it definitely it definitely didn't do a bad job. I would say, if you want a good chuckle along with your horror, I'd really recommend the Shudder original Deadstream. If you seen it, because that film had me howling with laughter.
Okay,
It is
I'm
a
just gonna say, and I
yeah.
mean this with all sincerity, fuck right off. I literally just watched that last night.
Really?
Yeah,
As in you liked it, or just a weird coincidence of we're lining up on what we've watched?
weird coincidence because me and
Yeah.
the wifey last night were like, oh, let's watch a horror movie because it's out, and I was like, oh yeah, totally. And I saw I saw a dead stream, and I was like, I watched at first I was like, I don't know. I watched the trailer of it. I was like, okay, let's watch it, and I loved it. I thought it was hilarious. That's
It it captures the YouTube era of character so well of that. I loved it with his character. Just for anyone who doesn't know the kind of concept of it, it's basically a disgraced streamer goes to a haunted house and has to try and survive a night there, and it all goes horribly wrong. But
yeah.
it's almost like doing a feature length parody of a YouTube apology video where somebody just gets taken through the transgressional ringer by a ghost for being a terrible human being, and it's great. It's so much fun. Great 80s practical effect gooiness,
Oh yeah.
and just really captures kind of everything that I kind of love about kind of just like horror being like a good fun time.
And
I
I
would
am
say.
so happy. I'm in the camp for horror movies that practical effects will always beat out any CGI.
Mm,
And so for me seeing all that, I was just like, okay, yeah, this is just right up my alley. Like I don't want to give anything away, which kind of sucks because I would love to talk about it,
mm.
but I highly recommend people just take a look at Deadstream. It's on Shutter. If you have Prime, you can do. I'm pretty sure they got like a 7-day trial.
Yeah,
It's worth it.
you can do like a plug-in trial, and you'll be able to get it there.
Yeah.
Try to think what else I've been watching. I've been this is just outside of the October month, but it's still something I'm doing throughout all of October. Me and a friend, we have a tradition called Beer and B movies, where we gather together, have some beers, and watch about 3 B movies in a night.
Yep.
And we've been steadily working through the back catalogue of Hammer Horror. Because I love Hammer horror movies, and if you want something that's just a little bit more like low intensity but just really fun, well acted, especially if you get any of the ones that are the Peter Cushing, Christopher Legio, they are just such a treat. They're just so much fun. I'd really recommend those if you've not explored them at all.
I,
uh
I have not actually experienced much of those ones.
the in terms of horror history, it's a big one, 'cause it was like they kind of burst onto the scene, kind of doing horror in color, and made big waves for, like, showing lots of blood and like and kind of nudity and stuff, and kind of emerging doing that. But the like the original Dracula, like where Christopher Lee is playing Dracula and Peter Cushing's Van Helsing,
Yeah.
it's so good, perfect. It's absolutely brilliant. I'd really recommend that. Um, the thing is, it's like, yeah, you might just have to give me a cut-off point because I watch a lot of horror movies. So it's, I will keep going. I mean, I'll throw out a recommendation because I will say, if you haven't seen Nope, I highly recommend checking out Nope.
That one was
Um,
good.
I very much enjoyed that, and I think a lot of people have been very mixed on it. But I thought it was
That was
very
kind of
enjoyable.
the Western slash alien invasion by what's his name? Something Peel. I
Oh,
forget his
John
first.
Peel, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's kind of, I don't want to, again, no one, I don't want to spoil anything for, but like, it's, you kind of go in expecting one thing, but it comes out being very much something else.
Oh.
And I think it's, yeah, if you've not seen it, it's uh very interesting, a very like thematically rich, I would say.
Oh, that's
Uh,
interesting. A little side note on that movie. I remember just because like I'm bilingual, right?
mm,
And I speak French, and every once in a while on YouTube I'll get French ads, and I actually got the movie Nope, uh, but in French, and I gotta say it loses a lot of its a f- feeling to it when
mm,
they just say no. I'm like,
no,
no,
yeah,
no, it can't be no. Like it has to be
has to be
no.
Nope.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it just lost so much of its feeling on it. But yeah, um, but yeah, I gotta say thank you for hopping on. This was a ton of fun. I
No
hope you
worries, my
had fun
pleasure.
too.
Oh, absolutely. No, this has been an absolute hoot. I think this has definitely been one of the interviews where I've been allowed to really let loose on the film, on the film side in a big way, which is not always advised, because I will talk for hours
Oh
about it.
yeah,
It's,
well
it's the
we're
thing.
we're
So,
an hour and a half in,
Ooh,
and
yeah.
like the audience of the podcast, as the people who are listening know, we are horrible for staying on topic. I've actually wanted to make a joke apology video saying sorry for always being off topic, but we can't help it. But
What,
yeah, no,
what,
this was a lot of fun. I had a ton of fun. I've wanted to talk horror movies with someone for a while now, and you were just the perfect person for me to randomly screech at.
Oh, thank you. Well, no, I wouldn't say random creature. And in defense of going off topic, I'd say, like, but that's to round it back to kind of game stuff in terms of like talking about design. I
Hmm.
think that's the thing though, is that like the more stuff you have passion for stories that are outside just the field of games,
Yeah.
it can really enrich your experience. And bringing that into design, I think, is something I'm a massive advocate for. So I think it's, in a way, talking about horror movies is very much on topic, because
Oh yeah.
it feeds in so much. And I think, especially with it being the Halloween season, if that's what people want to play on the tabletop, there's nothing better that you can do as someone who's GMing a horror game than going and watching some horror movies.
No, that's definitely true. One of or one of the other people on the podcast, Scott, he actually, whenever he writes a new setting, or because he's also a designer, he makes sure to binge the movie genre that he's actually writing about, just to keep him into the topic. And I definitely agree with you that talk about horror movies while talking about a horror system that also can be an acting system for it's very thematic. Maybe I'll try and add spooky music into this whole thing. Probably not, but yeah, no. Thank you so much for hopping on. If you ever want to come back and just talk random table talk stuff, you're more than welcome. This was a very enjoyable time, and yeah, thank you very much, Charlie. If any,
Absolutely. Thank you for
yeah,
having me. Yeah, it's been
oh yeah,
amazing.
it's been great. I remember the first thing I said to you is like, "You can swear, don't worry," and you're like, "That's so good." But yeah, thank you very much. If anyone wants to find any of your stuff, I am going to have a link in the description of this episode. But if you want to say anything additional of where people can find you,
Well,
um,
absolutely. I will cue the social media plug now. On Facebook, we're if you search Shiver RPG, you'll find us. We're on Instagram at Shiver RPG. You can find us on Twitter, very active on there at Games Parable. At Games Parable, so that's the name of our company, Parable Games, but slightly mixed up. Um, we also, if you want to try Shiver and buy the book, we have physical products out now. So we have the core rule book, the Cursed Library, which is our expansion book, and the Gothic, the first Gothic book out in digital format. You can find that over at www.parablegames.co.uk. That ships in United States territories as well, so you can order from that website, and it will be distributed to you. That we've seen there's been some confusion about shipping. People seem to think it's not available, but it definitely is. So please take a look. You can get physical stuff, don't worry. But also, yes, we're part of the Halloween sale as well, on Drive Through RPG. So if you want to kind of have a slightly cheaper inroad to trying the system, having a play around with it, you can find it there. And also, of the Parable Games web store, there is a link to Shiver RPG's own website where you can find the free dice roller, a free quick start guide, as well as downloads for our open gaming license and various other things if you feel so inclined to start making some Shiver content yourselves. And yeah, that's pretty much everywhere you can find us. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can drop us an email at contactparablegames at gmail.com.
and I'll make sure to have all that stuff in the link in the description. If you're listening to this while driving, wait till you stop driving, because we don't want to be liable for that. Plus, I think it looks bad. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Again, I'd like to thank Charlie for hopping on and letting us know about this awesome program, but product, but also for talking movies with me, something I don't get enough of. And yeah, if you enjoyed this episode, let me know. You can email me at rpsmartpeople@gmail.com. And if you hated this episode for some strange reason, you can tweet at me on Twitter at rpsmartpeople. Thank you again, and have a great week. See you next time.